dream. I was flying high, I was feeling fine. I won't be put in line, 'cause I'm ready to do my time.
Welcome to the Simply Financial Podcast. This is episode number 4, season number 3. I'm your host, Christopher Calandra. On today's episode, I have a returning guest. I've known Dave a very long time. I think he was maybe the first guest on the podcast. It was episode number 5. Seems like so long ago. But today, I wanted to talk with Dave Famiglietti. He is the owner of New Frontier Armory and the founder of New Frontier Armory, located in North Las Vegas. And we are going to talk about some of our favorite books from 2018. Dave and I talk regularly. We swap ideas for books. We have different reading lists by and large, but we've had some very good conversations that are not part of the podcast, and I thought I would bring it on to do an interview with Dave about some of the books we read recently, specifically 2018. So, Dave, thanks for joining me to chat about this.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I appreciate it.
So, first off, and I'm kind of blindsiding you because we didn't prep for this, but we had this interesting conversation, you and I, about reading the actual book versus listening to the book. Because I will admit, when I say I read things, it may very well have been that I listen to it. I'm a member of Audible.com. I have been for a while. I still read books, but a lot of books I listen to when I'm on the plane, I'm in the car, exercising. So if I say I read a book but I listened to it, am I being disingenuous?
I personally don't think so. I think it's the same thing. You're getting the content out of it. I have a lot of critical friends and family who even they listen to audiobooks.
Right.
But they'll correct me if I said, oh yeah, I read such and such a book last month. Well, you listened to it.
But then what do you say though? So if I say to you, hey, did you read XYZ book? Are you going to come and say, oh, I actually didn't read it, but I listened to it?
No, I'm a simple guy.
It doesn't make a difference to me.
I agree. So I told you a little bit. Actually, you put me onto Audible about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And I started using it. And I was, like I told you, I'm not the greatest in school, not a very good reader, don't comprehend very well when I read because I think I have that entrepreneurial mind that's just constantly going in 100 directions. So it's really hard. I'll flip through 3 pages of a book and then realize I have no idea what I just read over those 3 pages and have to go back. So the audio book for me has been huge. What I'm doing is I have about an hour a day between a back and forth drive to the gym and a back and forth drive to work. And I get about an hour a day of listening. I won't say reading, listening in. So before, where I pretty much gave up on reading paper books unless it was time for bed or something, maybe 2 a year that I would get through. I'd probably start 4 and maybe read 2 actual books a year. And now I think last year I added them up for this, and I think I did 22 books that I listened to last year. So I feel like that's all information that I missed out on if I wouldn't listen to them. So
now we're recording this in Dave's office in Las Vegas. And he said he doesn't read a lot of books, but I will say that he has a book on his shelf, The Gifted Boss by Dalton. I forget his first name. But where did you get that book?
That was gifted.
That was gifted.
Great friend, yeah.
Yes. Your great friend who?
Chris.
Yes. I like to read books. I like having a book in front of me and to read. But I have a big appetite for reading or consuming books. And so if I just strictly stuck to reading, I wouldn't get to nearly the things I want to get to. By supplementing it with the listening that I could do while I'm on the move, whether it's exercise or traveling, it works out really well.
I think it's huge. From a time management aspect, that was an hour that was wasted.
Sure.
So I've spent a lot more time over the past year. I've made a conscious decision that I stopped listening to the radio and the news in the car, and I schedule phone calls for times that I know that I'll be in transit somewhere where I can use that time on a phone call that I have to make anyway, or to read, listen to these books.
So, we're recording this, it's early 2019. Thinking back to over the last year, what would you say, well, first off, how many books do you think you read / listened to in 2018?
I think listened to them at about 22 to 24, and
wow.
Read 0.
All right. And so what was, What are some of the ones that, well, let me ask it this way. What would you say is the most impactful book? Can you point to one book you would say you would categorize as having the biggest effect on you?
I narrowed it down to about 3 or 4 that I would say were some of my, favorites that I can remember. A lot of them, I'll be honest, were flops. Something that I had a catchy title, I had some good subject matter, and I thought it'd be good. And,
okay.
And then I think either it was on a different level than I would look for advice, like it was something that remedial to me.
Sure.
And it kind of lost my interest, or it was something that I got into some more fitness and medical type stuff this year that it was way over my head and I couldn't understand and fall into. So some of the ones that stood out for me this year was Extreme Ownership. There's a book called Un-F Yourself.
Okay.
Another one, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and Leaders Eat Last, and The 4. Those were some that, like I said, if I had to remember all those 22, those would be the ones that I would actually remember.
All right, so let's go through those. Jocko, is it Willink?
Willink, yep.
Willink, I read that book, Extreme Ownership, very, very good. It's a leadership book based on his experience with Navy SEAL training as well as experience in the field. Very, very good. I think I may have mentioned this to you in preparation for this interview. He has a series, I don't know if it's a series, but he has at least a couple of books that are geared for children. And my son Dominic is 13, and I got him the kids' version of the book. And
that's awesome that he does that. Yeah, it's a really good book.
And all right, so that's one. And then The 4 was one of the most impactful books that I read in 2018.
Yep, that was actually recommended by you.
Okay.
So
I'm
I
on a
grabbed
roll.
that. Yep.
Yeah. So what did you think of that book? I found it amazing. The 4 is by the author's last name is Galloway, and it profiles the major, most influential 4 social media technology companies, they being Apple, Facebook, Alphabet, and...
Yes.
What am I missing? Apple,
Amazon.
Amazon, thank you.
Yeah, Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook.
And I found it to be a great book because it talks, Dave, about a lot of the virtues of those companies, how smart they are, how they bettered our lives, how they competed really fiercely. And so it talked very complimentary about those companies, including the founders. But then it also spent a lot of time talking about the underbelly of that, how they are blocking out competition, about us giving away our privacy rights, a whole variety of things that the problems that are being created by these companies, especially unhealthy competition. So I thought it was fabulous. What do you think?
Yeah, it was I liked it because it did shed light on both things. It kind of made you stop and realize how giant those 4 companies are and how much they actually control right now.
Yeah.
How much influence they have on decisions you're making without you being conscious of it. How much they're really in your lives and understand what you're doing every day and patterning you, and it's crazy. I mean, it's scary for a little bit, but then it also shows look at all these conveniences we're getting out of that information gathering.
And I liked it in particular, and I don't know if you feel the same way as I do. Some things that are, I'm going to say, politically charged or controversial. You read something and it's just a hit piece and it's negative, negative, negative. No matter what, the person could save people from a burning orphanage.
Doesn't matter.
And they would be critical of it. I thought it was very fair. It was complimentary in some instances and then critical in others. I thought it was very fair, and I really enjoyed that part of, hey, here's the pros, here's the cons.
For sure.
Very even-handed.
I like the same thing. That's why we had a discussion this morning actually at the gym about 24-hour news and the downfall of everything because of it, I think, right?
Yeah.
And how that's just polluting everybody. And we talk about, I'd rather just have information. And it's almost unfortunate that you can't really get a whole lot of good, here's an hour news recap for the world for the day.
Yes.
It's just almost not there anymore. It's going farther and farther towards opinions and whatever. So that's why I agree with you the way that book was done, where you're getting the facts and now you can make a decision. Do you like that technology or not? Or why, or the impact it's having on us.
All right, good. So you mentioned Leaders Eat Last.
Leaders Eat
Now,
Last.
I've heard of that book. I've never read it or listened to it, just to carry on the joke. So tell me why that book appealed to you.
So that one was the same thing, kind of similar to Extreme Ownership. It comes from the writer had a military background, and some of the stories inside kind of revolve around that. The author is Simon Sinek.
Oh, okay.
And Same kind of theory. It's that same mentality of if you can show, leading by example and showing your employees what you want from them, not just asking of them and living this entirely different life with entirely different values than you're expecting from the people around you.
So, I read another impactful book I read in late 2018 and actually straddled into 2019 was a book, When, by Daniel Pink. Mm-hmm. Have you read that?
I haven't yet.
So I had not read anything of Daniel Pink before, but it's basic, and you said it, some of the books that you might read at this stage of the game haven't been an avid reader of business books, leadership, marketing, motivation, how to be your best self-help kind of genre. This I thought was an interesting take because it really looked at the science of when to do things, not how to be rich, not how to win friends and influence people, not how to manage your time, but talked more about the science of when to do things in the day, in the project life, when to do analytical work versus non-analytical work. It looked at your sleep patterns and determined when you ought to do things, to categorize people based on their sleep patterns. So if you haven't checked that out, that's a pretty good one. I thought it was good.
I'll add that to my list.
Daniel Pink. So we missed one that you said with the funky name, Zebra.
Yeah, why zebras don't get ulcers.
All right, so tell me about that.
So it's one of my favorite ones. It's one of those books that it was recommended to me by a fitness coach friend of mine, and he knows that I have a pretty high stress lifestyle. I actually thrive on it at some point, but I think it does get to that unhealthy level here and there. He recommended it. Said I definitely needed to read it. I didn't really know what I was getting into when I started reading it. I knew it was something to do with stress and stress management. So I got into it, and it was one of the most simple theories and simple written books that I've ever listened to. But it was probably one of the most impactful for me. And it I've always had a pretty carefree attitude. I say I stress a lot, and I do.
Sure.
But at the same time, I'm so loose compared to other people I've known in my life that show that same level of stress. I unwind so easily as well. And I think I'm pretty carefree.
So summarize the book for me, and I'm probably going to read it because it's the name. How could you not read it after hearing that name?
So in a nutshell, it's basically talking about how we destroy ourselves with stress and overstress ourselves with things that really have nothing to do with us. It's kind of what I was talking about the 24-hour news. They use a lot of filler to constantly be bringing you material.
Sure.
And most of it pertains absolutely zero to you. You wouldn't know. You wouldn't even have an opinion on it any other way. You wouldn't care. But because they're pumping it into your head, you feel like pressured by it. You feel like it matters to you. You feel like you have to care, and you don't. And what it's talking about is how animals basically go around and they're not thinking about the stock market. They're not thinking about the news of the day. They're not thinking about what work they have to do or what they're going to cook for dinner. They're just living their lives. They live a very simple life, a very routine life. And they say, like, when they do all these tests on these animals, when animals sense fear, they stress. Then they go right back to normal afterwards. When that stress is over, when that immediate danger is not there anymore, they're going right back to a normal state. So they're much healthier overall. Overall health is much better in the animals because they don't have all this going on. So they're saying, like us, we stress about, what if this happens? What if that? We're making up stuff to stress about at that point, right? We're not saying like, well, next week I got this final exam that I have to study for. Or I have this big test at work, or I have whatever. That's something, that's something is in your immediate future. And if you want to stress about it, that's a choice you make, right? Mm-hmm. But we get to the point where, like, what if during this interview, Chris asked me this question? I'm going to worry about that. What if on my way to work I get in an accident? What if this happened? What if nothing? Like, just stop and relax. So it helped me kind of realize that a little more and put a positive spin on the way I do treat things, where people might say that I'm too carefree sometimes, where maybe I don't seem to care as much as maybe I should about some important things. It's just easier that way. Deal with it when it's time to deal with it.
So is this one of these books that, because hearing you speak about it, one of these books that's kind of an easy to digest, easy to read, not terribly thick or analytical?
Super easy and not very in-depth medical-wise with terminology or anything like that. Just a super easy read and just really, really simple subject that just hits you. Real obvious.
And so you read a lot of business books, right? You're an entrepreneur. You run a very successful business here in North Las Vegas. And then you have other entrepreneurial interests beyond your core business. So do you only read business books, or do you take time to do some non-business stuff?
I've made a pretty good switch about 3/4 of the way through last year to get away from a lot of the business books and self-help books. I found I still really like to read like the 4, where it's more of a biography type of thing, where it's stories about a successful company, or the 10 ways to do this and the 6 ways to do that. I've kind of really stayed away from that stuff because it gets really old. It's just people regurgitating information that we all already know.
And do you feel like I could write this, or I've read this
I
already
get
3
to
times?
the point where maybe I could have wrote it better than they did. So I switched over to. I'm a big outdoorsman. I like all kinds of outdoor sports and being in the wild and camping and fishing, hunting. So I've changed to a lot of older conservation stories, like 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s type stuff. When we decided that it was time to start managing game and putting public lands aside and doing a lot of conservation work. So I'm reading a lot of stuff.
So what are some of those titles?
So my favorite one out of that, there's a guy called Dick Prenicky. And he had a PBS special for a long time, so some people might have seen the videos. He went off in the early 60s, I believe, and he went off to Alaska, got dropped off with a few bags and his video recorder, and this is way before my time, so I don't know what kind of 35 millimeter or whatever, I don't know, whatever the old video cameras were. And he basically got dropped off in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors, no nothing, like nothing at all within walking or boating distance.
Right.
Built a cabin by hand with just tools that he brought. Built all of his silverware and utensils and all that stuff. And he wasn't like a lunatic trying to live off the grid. We weren't at that point back then. He just wanted to go and be out in nature and record nature in its natural state and whatever. So this guy, he basically goes through his daily life. So somebody wrote his diary out. And this was like one of the most positive books I've ever read, and gave me just a totally new outlook on everyday life.
All right, so now I'm not an outdoorsman. I'm not a hunter. The idea of getting dropped... If I got dropped off in Alaska like that...
The last thing you're going to do is write a book,
It would end badly, but it would be very quick. But you appreciate that kind of stuff. If you're a non-outdoorsman, would you appreciate the messaging in the book, or do you have to be...
I think so, because the message goes way past any of those hobbies and stuff. It's more of just simplifying his life, right? So he took all this other nonsense out of his life, and his problem for the day was like if the squirrel was going to come and invade his kitchen. But this guy was so happy being out there without the distractions and all this other negativity in his life,
right,
that he wouldn't talk bad about anything. Like, well, I woke up to another 7 feet of snow, so it looks like I'm stuck inside today. But on the bright side, I'll have time to catch up on whittling or this or that. Like, it was nothing negative.
So it sort of seems to tie into the zebra book because, I'm still a Northeasterner, and so we deal with snow, and you, driven a lot by the media, is, it's going to snow. Am I going to be able to keep my meetings? Am I going to be able to go to work? And my employees are going to be? Will the kid's game get canceled? And I got to plow the driveway, and none of that really matters that much. So I have one that's related. I have a few books I read last year that are non-business related, and I agree with you. The self-help genre is kind of worn out for me. It's done wonders for me. Huge fan of it, but I don't know. I just been there, done that a little bit. But I do love human interest stories, and I like history where you could learn from it, and it has business applications. It has relational skills that you could draw from it. But the book that I have that's related to you is a book called Stranger in the Woods. Mm-hmm. The author is Finkel. And candidly, nobody recommended it to me. But I was in the library. I actually read this one. I was in the library, and at the end of the aisles, they'll have displays, and it caught my attention. But the long and short of it is this young man in Maine back in the mid-1980s. Back in the mid-1980s, normal upbringing, no trauma. He leaves his car in the woods of Maine, and he doesn't come out for like 36 years. He just lives in the woods in Maine. And it appears that he didn't speak to anybody for all these years. So it's a neat book. And what's cool about it, when I first started reading it, it seemed like, oh, neat, this like weird guy doesn't want to be with people, this, that, the other thing. But the book really goes into a lot of why you need people, relationships, and this guy was perfectly content not talking to anybody. He didn't dislike people. He didn't have a problem with people, but he was just super content. Now, the funny thing is he was living off the land by stealing from people's seasonal cabins, and eventually he got caught, went to the well too often. But once he got put in the system, he got put back into society. He couldn't live in the woods, and he wasn't happy. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty good book.
I'll check it out.
And then another one I have, you're former military, served U.S. Air Force. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of the book Devotion?
Yes.
Did you read it?
Yep, not yet. No.
Oh my God, it's amazing.
Is it good? Good.
So unbelievably good. Probably the best book I've read last year. It doesn't have the business impact or the macro view that the 4 gives you about the world and what's happening, but it's so good. The central character and the central story in that book is unbelievably powerful. And I bet you they make it into a movie too. It's very, very good. That author actually has another book called A Higher Call, which is really good. That's a World War II era book. Devotion is Korean War. But that's who told you about Devotion?
I heard about it. I think I read it was one of my highlights that when they kind of suggest books for you and stuff. Mm-hmm. That was one of the ones that showed up.
All right, and I understand that you sometimes will reread some books that are classics, or at least books that really you're close with and had an important role to play in your life. So have you reread anything recently?
I giggled a little bit when you said classics, because God forbid my high school English teachers are listening.
Yeah.
I still haven't read the actual classics, to be honest with you. I watched a bunch of the movies and read some cliff notes.
You didn't reread Shakespeare or The Grapes of Wrath?
But some for me, yeah. There's some that really... you get to a point where you can read a book and it might not even be the content of the book that's helping you do something, but an idea that you get that's sparked because of the subject you're reading on or whatever. So some of those for me that I've reread, I bet you I've reread each one of these books at least 5 times. And these are all books that I actually physically read years ago. And then now I listen to them over and over. But yeah, I bet you this year I've probably listened to each of these 3 or 4 times. And I know I've read them 3 or 4 times each. But Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People.
All right.
I can't get a lot of people to like that book because it's old school. Because it's like, who is this guy? You're going to listen to this 90-year-old guy who was already outdated at the time.
Yeah, he was already old when that came.
Yeah, he was already old when it came out, and the book came out 100 years ago. What are you doing? It's the principles behind it, and it still works today. Obviously, you got to change the lingo a little bit, but think of the different outcomes you get when you go in, you get bad service somewhere, and you go in and start throwing a fit and raising your hands and doing whatever and screaming and yelling, versus, hey, how you doing today? These 3 things were really good, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this bad thing that happened and see what we can do to improve it, whatever. That positive attitude makes a huge difference. Mm-hmm. So I'm on both sides of that counter a lot, right? Okay. As a customer and as a business owner. Mm-hmm. So as a business owner, I would go 100 times out of my way if you have a problem with my product, period, no matter what, right? I'll go an extra 100 times if you're not an ass about it. If you come to me and you just explain, hey,
sure,
stuff happens. This happened. We don't know why yet. Let's figure out why. I'm not going to accuse you of anything. You're not going to accuse me of anything. And we're going to just work out the problem. So just having a positive attitude, being friendly to people, getting what you want.
All right.
Basically. Maybe it's a selfish reason, but it's being a better person to make sure you're getting what you want out of people.
All right. What else do you reread?
So that's one of them. The other one is 4-Hour Workweek. Same thing.
That's one of my favorites, and I reread that.
That was one that you actually sent me years ago, 5 or 6, 7 years ago. I bet you sent me that book, and I read it. And at the time, it was more of a fantasy than anything. But the more and more that I read it, it's the same thing. I know the book by heart now, but it sparks ideas on how I can do more with automation, more automating. Hey, something we try to do here is every 6 months we go through and I talk to the girls in the office that are dealing with the customers, and they're the ones reading the 300, 400 emails a day. And we try to say, okay, we've automated all these processes. If a customer wants this information, we've done it to where you don't have to do a lot of work. Mm-hmm. What's the next thing down that list? What is the most common thing you deal with, and how do we make it a more automated process? And how do we do this stuff so we can kind of all free up more time to do different things?
I understand what you're saying. So you read the book, and some of it's applicable, some of it's not. Some of Tim Ferriss, the author's ideas are extreme, and not everyone can adopt everything. I think that's fantastical. It seems to me that Tim Ferriss hasn't even adopted everything in his own book. But when you read that, you get your creative juices flowing on how you can manage your time, how you could leverage technology, how you could be more efficient, how you could cut out time wasters, the things that exhaust you that are not important. So that's good. I reread that book regularly also. I know we joked before about The Gifted Boss, but I reread that book regularly. And that's similar to the book I think you described. It's an easy read. I mean, you could bang that out in 1 or 2 sittings easily. What are a couple of the others that you reread?
Another one that I caught myself reading 3 times, I think, already this year, and I read it once in 17 and 3 times in 18, was called The Power of Habit.
Okay.
And it's a newer book, but it's another one that's just so obvious that it just sparks something inside you. There's no new principles in there. It talks about exactly what it says, the power of habit. If you can take some bad habits and turn them into good habits. A lot of people talk about, well, I'm going to break this habit, or my New Year's resolution is going to be this, but they never make a plan. They never set a goal. They don't do anything to replace it. So quitting smoking is one. I smoked for a long time. Decades. And next week will be my 1-year anniversary without a single step up, no going back at all, no desire to go back, but it was one of those things where I was just replacing it. So they're saying, there's a bunch of medical studies in there and psychoanalyst stuff, and a lot of it is basically you cannot get rid of a bad habit. Your bad habit will always be there. You have to replace it with something else and train yourself to know that when it's time for that bad habit, it's something else. It's not that anymore. And I found that to be true with a whole bunch of stuff, and it's helped me in my daily life basically make time for the things that are more important now as I grow a family and whatever, and putting that first. So most of the time I try to before my business. But part of that habit was, talking about a good daily structure. And no, this is your time. If your time in the morning is to go to the gym for an hour and then make breakfast with your kids, then that's your time, and don't cross that line. If it's not an emergency, don't cross that line. Make that your habit and do it and respect it. Beautiful. And then you start business afterwards.
So as we begin to wind down, time flew by. Any books that you could point to that you're anxious to read? I know I'm going to be reading the 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Harari. It's highly recommended to me. I don't know, have you heard of that?
Not yet.
I don't really know much about it, but that's next up. And that's more of a business book. I don't know about you. I try and do different genres. Otherwise, they kind of blur together. So if I read like a finance book, then the next one won't be a finance book. But if I read history books back to back, then I'll start confusing Civil War with World War II. So
that's definitely something I've been trying to do as well. So yeah, mine this year, the Just for Fun, and it's probably boring to a lot of people. I want to read the transcripts of the Lewis and Clark diaries.
Okay.
And it's long. It's 60 hours or 60 or 70 hours.
Is that a book?
It's several series of books, yeah. So there's been books on it. There's been books like condensed version, Cliff Notes versions. Sure. But these are the actual transcripts of the diaries, read word for word.
So listeners, I would not recommend you read the Lewis and Clark diaries.
So no, I'm kind of excited. I like that kind of stuff, the frontiersmen and how things were settled and the way it was back then. And hearing their description of, you got to remember, like, they came out west and they're describing things that nobody has ever seen before. Animals, elk, stuff like that. Like, stuff that they don't have names. Nobody even knows. So to listen to them, I think that's kind of cool. And then my next business one on the chopping block is Shoe Dog.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah, I read that actually last year.
Is it worth keeping on my list?
It is. It's very good. But it's like you said, it's not heavy on business. It's more a little history about how Nike became the powerhouse it is. It's a little business because you learn some of the things that he did well and some of the mistakes that Phil Knight had starting, building, and growing the company. But it's mostly just a human interest story, and it's not terribly heavy. So it's a good one. So thank you for joining me today. We'll have at my website, the Elliott Wealth website, www.elliottwealth.com. we'll set up a landing page where you could see a list of all the books that Dave and I talked about. While you're at the website, please, if you're not a client already, you could sign up for a complimentary consultation with me so that we could talk about your goals, objectives, how we could help you win with money. And please subscribe to the podcast. I want to grow the listener base. I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe and recommend to someone that they subscribe to. Thanks much. I'll be back with you very soon.
The views expressed are not necessarily the opinion of SagePoint Financial Incorporated and should not be construed directly or indirectly as an offer to buy or sell any securities mentioned herein. Investing is subject to risks, including loss of principal invested. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. No strategy can assure a profit nor protect against loss. Please note that individual situations can vary. Therefore, the information should be relied upon when coordinated with individual professional advice. Please note, the information being provided is strictly as a courtesy. When you link to any of the websites provided here, you are leaving this website. We make no representation as to the completeness or accuracy of the information provided at these websites, nor is the company liable for any direct or indirect technical or system issues or any consequences arising out of your access to your use of third-party technologies, websites, information, and programs made available through this website. When you access one of these websites, you are leaving our website and assume total responsibility and risk for your use of the websites you are linking to. Securities and advisory services are offered through SagePoint Financial Incorporated, member FINRA SIPC. Insurance services offered through Elliott Wealth Management, LLC, not affiliated with SagePoint Financial.
Simply Financial is part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can find Exvadio podcasts at exvadio.com/podcast, the Apple Podcasts app, iTunes Store, iHeartRadio app, Spotify, Stitcher, and wherever you find podcasts. So join us and stay informed and entertained.